climate change really does change everything. If we're going to meet the sort of kind of global targets or stabilize global temperatures, then we're going to have significant change, whether we like it or not, either through the transformations that we go through, or if we don't meet it, we're also going to have major change as well. And it's kind of permeated in the back of my mind for quite some time now. So what does this actually mean for science and research? What does it mean for the ways in which we produce and use knowledge? Are we going to have to change that too? And so I started thinking about this a couple of years ago, as I was a little bit frustrated about the inability to get action happening in terms of the changes that we might need. And it really kind of got me thinking that, is it really good enough what we're doing already? And Phil Hanlon, who is a public health researcher in Glasgow, he kind of found a nice way of summarizing some of the challenges. And that is that many of the advances in knowledge that we have had over the last 300 years are actually part of the problem. He points out that scientific research, whilst it's brought phenomenal benefits, not to be discounted, it's brought phenomenal benefits, has also created some of the challenges or been part of some of the challenges. So climate change is a result partly of some of the scientific advances and the technological advances for fossil fuel extraction, for example. Or obesity is partly the result of the scientific and technological advances that have affected mobility patterns, for example. So in itself, the knowledge, whilst the scientific sort of and research paradigm has been very helpful in many, many ways, it has also been contributing to some of the problems, and we can't just use the same kind of methods to address the current problems that we have. And what he really points out is that in addition to the knowledge, it's not just about knowledge, we also have to take into consideration of what is good and what is beautiful. And somehow that normative dimension has been missing, and that science and research have often not been accountable to the society. And then there's this other part of that is, are we actually learning fast enough? We have to make rapid changes if we're going to address things like climate change, yet we have to then accelerate the learning processes possibly around that too. We can't just wait for the 10, 20 years for an idea to permeate down into practice. We just don't have the time for that. So that raises this kind of question in my mind about what kind of changes, what changes do we need in order to think about how we both produce knowledge and how that is integrated or used in different forms in different settings. To explore that a little bit further, this is just a simple framework that is often used by Karen O'Brien, and that really just sets the scene for thinking about where those changes might need to happen. So this framework is just really identifying, we have what we call the practical sphere, the systemic sphere, and the cultural sphere. The practical sphere is the kind of stuff, the doing things that we do. We can often change maybe the research methods, maybe the ways we make decisions, or the policy making and so on. The systemic levels then affect that practical sphere, and that's the systems and structures, the institutions and so on that influence that. And then on the outer sphere are the cultures and the paradigms and the assumptions that we have that then have that big influence on those other spheres. The key thing about that, though, is that it's when you get the changes at the outer levels and the sort of middle levels where you get the biggest change at the practical levels as well. Just to go into that a little bit more depth, give you some examples. Well, at a cultural paradigm sphere, one of the things that has happened often in research and science is this kind of assumption that we are separate from the world that we're looking at. We're stepping and looking in from the outside into that world. And yet we are actually part of the system as well. So we also need to be thinking about how that paradigm also changes too. So stepping in from the outside and looking at things from the outside sort of separates us from many of the things and the learning opportunities that we might have, for example, learning from practice. There are different kind of ways and knowing that are important in that. And that kind of assumption, it also permeates down to the systemic level. So for example, it kind of helps and thinks, it also sort of creates a traditional separation of knowledge institutions from the practical institutions. So what is learned in the practical institutions is separate from the traditional knowledge institutions like higher education institutes and so on. And as Ed Hackett kind of pointed out a couple of years ago, he kind of highlighted it's unlikely, he felt, that the innovations needed will come from higher education institutions themselves. A lot of the innovations are coming from outside of that area. The knowledge is being created and used in different settings. And then that leads to the kind of practical sphere. And one of the kind of examples of this that I've been thinking about a lot is that I'm quite curious as to why we spend so much emphasis understanding the problem, perhaps less identifying the solutions, and almost very, very little about actually how we facilitate the change, the how-to kind of questions. And I haven't looked at the research directly, but I did look at about 5,000 papers flick through 5,000 papers on climate change, and I reckon it was something about 95% were on understanding the problem. So we tend to focus on this element and at the expense of actually how do we do the change. That also then kind of is related. I was thinking about, well, where's that coming from? And one of the things that comes from, I think, is a little bit of the emphasis on particular kinds of knowledge in our traditional research institutions. So epistemic knowledge, so Aristotle identified 3 kinds of knowledge. He talked about epistemic knowledge, and these are the principles, these are the sort of written word, the PowerPoints, that kind of thing, that is articulated in that kind of form. It's the conceptual and the theoretical. But there's also the techne, which is the know-how. How do I know how to use this computer? How do I know how to install a solar panel or something like that? That's the kind of know-how knowledge. Often embodied, it's difficult to articulate, often difficult to articulate in a written form. And then there's the phronesis, which kind of combines the first two, but particularly the techne, which is about the notion of where do you get the wisdom from in order to make sense of, am I doing it in the right way, or to achieve a good end, or to achieve the right kind of end from a moral perspective? So that wisdom comes in part of that too. And again, that's very much an embodied knowledge. And David Tabara came up with a fantastic analogy when I was talking to him at the last conference in 2015. And he said, yeah, it's kind of like trying to learn to ride a bicycle. You just can't learn to ride a bicycle by watching a PowerPoint presentation. You actually have to get on and fall off and start again. So it's that getting on and falling off we have to engage with to get to these different kinds of knowledge, which allows us to get to that how-to question as well. So yes, there is research and work happening in these spaces, but it tends to be much, much less than some of the other things that are happening too. And that kind of leads to some different ways of thinking about research. So how research is conducted, by whom and what for. So you could think about research on practice, observing the practice, and that has a level of validity as well, or research for us practice, where you might think about an engagement of many different practitioners and researchers together, but even research through practice. If I think of artists, I'm not an artist, but I always imagine that artists are creating something, an art piece like last night that we saw, which was wonderful, but actually it's the process through doing that's really important, and the process itself is a form of knowledge. So is it possible to conceive of the process of creating a transformative policy as a form of knowledge in its own right as well? So I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. Can we really radically think about different ways of doing things that will help us accelerate how we think about moving towards transformations? And for me, it raises a whole bunch of critical questions. What would a transformed system of knowledge production and its use, both in different ways, look like if it were to accelerate learning about and facilitate transformations? What would this look like in the different spheres? And how do we get there? What would we need to put in place to get there? And also, what do we need to keep from the current system? There are many things. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are many things over the last 300 years that have really helped us in many sorts of ways. So it's not about saying that one is better than the other. It's about saying, okay, let's have another think and look at this and see how we can accelerate how we learn, but also how we facilitate transformations as well. So that's really just setting the scene for today. What's going to happen now is we've got a couple of keynotes, but this afternoon, particularly in the latter half of the afternoon, we're going to engage in a whole exercise together. There will be breakouts, different groups moving into different rooms. That'll all be explained later. But we're going to start looking at those questions. And my goal by the end of this conference, and I'll explain again that a little bit more later as well, but by the end of this conference, we will have a collective statement that we can make regarding some of these sorts of questions, okay? And I don't know the answer to them. If I knew the answer, then I could tell you, but I don't. But I'm opening this up as a collective conversation that we can have around that this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce our next keynote. So Lindsay Levin, and Lindsay has a phenomenal background, not from research particularly, but also from the learning and the practice in the work that she does, which she'll explain when she gets up here. So over to Lindsay. Thank you very much.